Welcome to Betrayal Recovery Radio, the official podcast of APSATS, the Association of Partners of Sex Addict Trauma Specialists, hosted by Dr. Jake Porter. APSATS is a nonprofit organization providing professional training and compassionate support to partners affected by problematic sexual behavior and betrayal trauma. In each episode, Dr. Jake guides a conversation of enlightening insights and practical tools to empower those affected by sex addiction and betrayal trauma to use their voices and live their values. The mission of Betrayal Recovery Radio is to offer hope to those in need of healing and growth to those moving through grief. And now, here's your host, Dr. Jake Porter.
Welcome to Betrayal Recovery Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Jake Porter. And I am so grateful that you are joining me for this episode of the podcast. This is the podcast of APSATS, the Association of Partners of Sex Addict Trauma Specialists. And if you're unfamiliar with APSATS, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them before we get into the real meat of the episode today. APSATS is a nonprofit that exists to advocate for betrayed partners, those who have been affected by sex addiction. And it does that through education and especially through training, helping professionals to work with those who have been affected by chronic betrayal and the discovery of sexual addiction. Here in just a moment, I'll tell you about some of the things that APSATS has coming up. But what I want to tell you first is that APSATS is now offering something free for you as a listener to Betrayal Recovery Radio. If you go to apsats.org, that's apsats.org/podcast, apsats.org/podcast. There you're going to find a free download for anyone who is interested. It is a presentation from one of our very own APSATS certified therapist, Crystal Hollenbeck, Dr. Crystal Hollenbeck, and it is a presentation entitled, "What Should the Betrayed Expect from the Betrayer in the Therapeutic Process?" So I wanted to lead with that today, so you could go and get that, apsats.org/podcast, or find that link in the description below. Today, you're going to get to listen on a conversation between two of my favorite colleagues, Andrea Rogers, who is here in the Houston area, who works within her own practice, and during which is my practice, and she is going to be interviewing Cat Etherington. Cat is the director of recovery for Naked Truth Project, an international ministry opening eyes and freeing lives from the damaging impacts of pornography and other problematic sexual behaviors. Cat is a certified professional life coach and integrative therapist working with individuals and couples impacted by problematic sexual behavior and betrayal. The first ever European practitioner to be certified by the Association of Partners of Sex Addiction Trauma Specialists, Cat now serves on our board of directors and delivers their clinical training, the multidimensional partner trauma model training, and has become a vocal and passionate advocate for the experience of betrayed partners. The conversation between Cat and Andrea that you'll be listening in on today originally was a part of the Choose Connection Summit that I offered this past year online. And the title of Cat's conversation here is Finding My True Identity After Betrayal. As a betrayed partner herself, Cat is going to share insights on the topic of shame and healing after betrayal. She'll illuminate the ways in which the experience of trauma can make way for post-traumatic growth and healing that lead to a solid sense of self and identity, sharing from her own personal story as well as her clinical and coaching experience. She'll also suggest some specific tools that can help to manage shame and lead toward fierce self-compassion. All right, before I release you to hear that conversation between Cat and Andrea, just a few other things going on that I want to make sure you know about. On December 6th, APSATS is going to be hosting a presentation from Bill Herring titled Applying the Problematic Sexual Behavior Framework to Chronic Sexual Behavior. I love Bill's work, and this is going to be a great presentation. If you're interested in that and everything I'm talking about here, you can go to apsats.org to find out more. The cornerstone training of APSATS is the multidimensional partner trauma model training. If you work with this population and you've not yet taken this training, or if you hope to work with this population one day, I cannot recommend it highly enough. 4 days live via Zoom. The multidimensional partner trauma model training is going to be offered this upcoming January, the 6th through the 9th, 2025. So you can go and register for that while spots are still available. One last opportunity I want to let you know about is on January 17th. There will be a certification Q&A with APSATS president, Jeannie Vitoni. And so if you're interested in certification, wondering what that would entail, have some questions about that process, that is an opportunity to hear directly from APSATS and get those questions answered. One last announcement I'll make, if you're not aware, I recently released a book, little tiny thin thing you can see, and so it's not too much to read, but on couple-centered recovery, the model I created, a partner centered model, trauma-informed model, but for working together as a couple for healing after betrayal. And I'm giving this book away for free if you just go to my website, drjakeporter.com/breakingbarriers. And again, that link will be in the description below. Love to get you a free copy of that book, and so that it might be another resource for you in this journey. All right, without further ado, let me turn it over now to Andrea and Kat.
Hello, I'm Andrea Rogers, and I am excited about having a conversation with my guest today. She may not be a stranger to you. She's certainly not to me. Cat Etherington is the director of recovery for Naked Truth Project, an international ministry opening eyes and freeing lives from the damaging impacts of pornography and other problematic sexual behaviors. Cat is a certified professional life coach and integrative therapist working with individuals and couples impacted by problematic sexual behavior and betrayal. She is the first ever European practitioner to be certified by APSATS and now serves on the board of directors and delivers the clinical training and has become a vocal and passionate advocate for the experience of betrayed partners. Kat, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be back at the Choose Connection Summit. Thanks for having me.
Right, you're no stranger to being here. How does it feel to be the first European practitioner? That's amazing.
Yeah, I loved being able to say that, and there's been a good few since me now. But you know, bringing the multidimensional partner trauma model, the partner sensitive betrayal trauma approach to the UK will probably be one of those things that, you know, I would have written on my gravestone if I could, because it feels like a pretty cool achievement.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, you know, if I hadn't said that, people might have thought you were a native Texan or something with your accent. So
Right.
I'm glad we
Yeah,
cleared
it's a
that
good
up.
job you let people know.
Right. Well, today I'm excited to get into your talk. You're going to be talking about something that I think so many people will be able to relate to, and that's finding your identity after betrayal. Why don't you give us a little sneak peek into what you're going to be covering today?
Yeah. Well, and so what it didn't say in my bio, but it does say in sort of other versions of my bio, is that I come to practice with betrayal related circumstances and clients from a wealth of personal experience, not only of betrayal, but also of addiction.
Mhm.
And so I am super interested in the intersection between some of my experiences with addiction that were then kind of in some ways compounded and in other ways really beautifully healed in my experience of betrayal and walking out and kind of healing from betrayal trauma. And in particular, one of the areas that I've become super interested in is shame. And I'm hoping that I can share some of my personal experiences and my professional observations around the role of shame in recovery from betrayal in particular, but also in addiction. And so that's what I think we're going to talk about, because I think shame is really an identity question. And so that's what I'm interested to bring.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I think that it's a topic that no matter how much we talk about it, we can't talk about it enough. Because
Right.
it's such a big part of the experience of navigating betrayal. So why don't you tell me, like, how does betrayal impact the identity of the betrayed in relation to shame? Let's start there with the betrayed.
Yeah, and I hope that when I'm talking about this from the perspective of the betrayed and then the betrayer, that I'll make a helpful distinction between kind of that surface level of shame and that more developmental kind of identity of shame. Because I'm going to say some stuff that's going to feel really obvious to people about how betrayed partners experience shame, because they're obvious in some ways, that the sort of key messages associated with betrayal for the betrayed are around not being enough somehow, not being good enough, not being sexy enough, not being available enough. And I'm not saying they're true, but I'm saying that they feel true in the immediate aftermath of betrayal. But what we also experience, I think, as betrayed partners is a whole lot of shame around what it looks like to walk through recovery. We feel shame about having trusted somebody who has proven to be untrustworthy. We feel like we should somehow have known. We feel like the choices that we make in recovery are open to judgment. If we stay, we get judged. If we leave, we get judged. And so there can be a whole lot of shame, even around kind of the choices that we make immediately after we enter recovery. And so it's interesting to me to think about shame as like a social or relational emotion, right? There's this sense in which shame is attached to a fear that we're going to be judged or exposed as somehow defective or inadequate. And so, the betrayed partner's experience is exactly that. It's one of being very open to scrutiny. Are we doing it right? Does it say something about who we are as people? And often betrayed partners will take on responsibility for things that really sit with the betrayer, right? The choices that somehow we should have known, somehow we should have expected, somehow we should have seen that happen. And so we can sort of misplace that responsibility onto ourselves. And I think there's interesting reasons why people do that. I know when I was experiencing my own betrayal story, I think there's a sense of maybe that gives me a little bit of power if I somehow made that happen, or if I somehow didn't do something that I could have done that might have meant this wouldn't have happened, then maybe I can save myself from happening again. It creates a bit of psychological safety. But yeah, there are lots of ways that shame will show up for betrayed partners.
Yeah, and I think that last thing you said is really valid, because if I admit that I'm not responsible, it increases my feelings of powerlessness and
Right.
helplessness. So if there's nothing I can do, if I didn't cause this, then how do I prevent it from happening again? And that's a really scary place for a partner to be.
Right. And then there's this whole like existential shame that comes with the betrayal experience, where we're asking big questions about who people are and who we are, therefore, in relation to those people. And so I think there's sort of something existential or foundational that's impacted in terms of our self-knowing. It makes us question kind of everything about ourselves, what we know, what we don't know, who we thought we were, who we think we are now, and all of that has the potential to be shame inducing.
So what about the betrayer? You talked about the betrayed, but what about the betrayer?
Yeah. And, we talk a lot about shame with the betraying party. And again, I think there are some really obvious ways that this might show up. And typically, I would see that as kind of like a moral injury that a lot of my male betraying clients will experience. It's a clash of their morality and their values. Of course, they feel bad about what they've done. And even as I was thinking this through, I'm like, yeah, like there's where you see the relational aspect of shame, because a logical question to ask would be, well, shouldn't they feel bad about what they're doing before it gets discovered? And I get that question. But because shame is a relational experience, what's interesting to understand, I think, from the betrayer perspective, is that often they have a whole set of mechanics that help them contain whatever feelings of shame might be present without somebody else knowing. But all of that fails when it's out here in the open, right? So I call them mental gymnastics, these like cognitive distortions that people have to create, these stories and permission giving thoughts and compartmentalizations that mean that I don't have to feel that shame when somebody else isn't looking. But of course, once the discovery breaks, once the behavior is out there, those strategies fail entirely, and that shame is very, very acute for them as they are brought face to face with the truth and the reality and the consequences that they've been really trying to hide from themselves and everybody else.
The visual that came to my mind is like, everybody has that closet in their home that when people are coming over, you just throw stuff in that closet because, you don't want people to see it. And it's no big deal when nobody sees it. But the one day somebody comes to your house and mistakes that for the bathroom, and they open that door and they see all the stuff in there, the shame that comes flooding in. It's like, that sounds to me like what you're describing with the betrayer.
Right. And here's where I wanted to kind of make a bit of a differentiation, because I think this is sometimes misunderstood about shame, is that when we're talking about shame, we're typically describing, as we have just done, that kind of acute presentation of shame when I'm in the midst of the truth being out and me feeling shame, or in the midst of having had an experience that communicates something about being not good enough. That's like an acute presentation of shame. It's in direct response to something that's happening right now. But a lot of my clients have a more chronic presentation of shame, which is something that pre-exists the betrayal breaking in the relationship. And this is more like, so if we're describing this kind of acute shame, this is more like chronic shame. This is shame that is born in family of origin experiences. It's shame that is born in attachment relationships early in childhood. And this is that messaging that differentiates kind of the feeling of shame from what I would label like the identity of shame. So a lot of my clients, whether betrayer or betrayed, will also have this kind of developmental shame, which they've been carrying with them from childhood, where somehow they have interpreted the experiences that they're having in childhood as being about them not being worthy, them not being lovable, them not being enough in some way. And so when you have that chronic shame, and then you have these acute experiences of shame, you have this kind of double experience that makes it so debilitating. And so I think what I would want to say from the betrayed's perspective is, not everybody has that. And if you don't have that, your shame is chronic, is acute, and it's painful, and it's really, really tough. If you also, though, have this chronic developmental attachment-based shame in your family of origin history, you're going to find that those things marry beautifully together. The shame lies of the present are going to connect with this shame identity. Some people call that like a shame core. And that's going to become a complicating factor in trying to disassociate from the messages of betrayal and deception.
Right. I mean, I'm just thinking that's so powerful. It's if it's something that has always been present, it doesn't feel like something you can get rid of. It's like a part of who you are.
Right. It's like woven into your DNA if
Right.
it's been there since your early childhood experiences.
Right, right. So, I mean, you have a unique perspective, given that you have your own journey through addiction and your own journey through betrayal. Say about, your experience coming from both sides. Like, how does that play into it?
Yeah. So I had the chronic shame, I had the shame identity. And actually, recently, I was reading some research around this idea of shame containment theory. It's
Mm,
brand new research from a colleague here in the UK. And she conceptualized what I've been trying to kind of articulate from my own experience in a really helpful way. So she talked about this kind of developmental, attachment-based, chronic experience of shame. And she said people who have that find ways to contain that, to like your closet analogy, like they shut the door, they pretend it doesn't exist, and they find ways to contain that. Now, the ways that I found to contain that were largely focused in my early life around being good and perfect, people pleasing, overachieving. If I'm just a really good girl, nobody will ever have to know that I'm not enough, that I'm not okay the way that I am. And that worked pretty well for some period of time. But it didn't work well forever. And so those strategies that I used to contain my shame had to develop as I developed. And
mhm.
so they morphed from just kind of straight up people pleasing and being good and perfect to a kind of social chameleon type behavior where I could just be whoever I needed to be acceptable to the people around me. And I was giving away my sense of identity left, right, and center. Like, I don't know who I am because who I am really just depended on who I'm around and what they needed from me. And so I had a whole bunch of strategies that helped me to contain that chronic identity of shame that I was carrying. And eventually, addiction became the most successful strategy that I came across. Like, I was addicted to heroin. It's a very successful way to block out feelings of shame. And so that became my primary shame containment strategy. But every now and again, and this is what the researcher is saying, that when you kind of walk around with this feeling of contained chronic shame inside of you, every now and again, that's going to get poked. Someone else is going to activate that by opening your cupboard door by mistake, and they're going to see that you're carrying all of this shame. And so when that happens, we need another set of strategies to help us recontain that shame. And so, your betrayed partners are going to recognize this as defensiveness and gaslighting and, kind of shutting the door and saying, you must be crazy, there's nothing behind that door, and all of that stuff. And I did a bunch of that in my own experience of addiction. So, the ways that I recontained my shame were around manipulation, around deception, around image management. And I was really fantastic at playing that good and perfect role. And so that would serve me in sort of recontaining some of that shame when it was activated in relationships. And so all of that was kind of happening, and I was in recovery from addiction, working on that stuff. And then my betrayal story broke. and all the contained shame that was still there was just poked in every which way. And so all of those strategies, good and perfect, denial of reality, not being honest about how I felt, being able to bend myself into whatever shape you needed me to be, all of those things were reactivated in me as I tried to navigate this new experience of shame.
Wow. I mean, I'm listening to you and I'm just thinking of all the clients that we come across and trying to explain this, what you said, that contained shame, that I have to have more containment strategies when the contained shame gets poked. So, we talk about that the addiction itself is really a symptom to a bigger problem, right? That even if you stop the acting out behavior, that all of those root behaviors, like you're talking about, the contained shame, now it's exposed. And so I have to come up with new
It's
containment
uncontained.
strategies. Right. Right. And then I mean, I'm picturing you navigating both sides of this equation as the betrayed partner. It's like validating all of what you thought, that you weren't good enough, that there was something wrong with you.
Right.
Now, as a person in recovery from addiction and as a betrayed partner.
Right. And the way that I explain this to my clients sometimes is just with a really simple picture. It's like, hopefully the women, at least, who are listening to this will relate to this, right? Women nowadays, we don't like to wash our hair every day. It's not good for our hair. It strips it of all its natural oils, right? And so there is like a thing that happens for me on hair wash day, which is that my hair just smells beautiful and it's all soft and shiny. And if you came to me on hair wash day and you said, Kat, your hair smells weird and it doesn't look very shiny, there's no way I'm going to believe you, because I know that my hair smells good. I know that when I move my head to the side, I get that little waft of scent. And so shame is like that, right? Like what I know about myself, or what I think I know about myself, has to connect with that external perception in order
Mm-hmm.
for it to be true. So if you say to me 3 days post hair wash, your hair smells a bit funky today, I'm probably going to go, oh gosh, and I'm going to doubt myself because I don't know today that my hair smells amazing like I did 3 days ago. And so what you're describing is exactly right. It's like this external messaging connects with something that already feels deeply true to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it a much more challenging proposition to deflect, to reject. And so we're looking at how do we contain that if that's true, because I don't want that to be true. In fact, the feeling of uncontained chronic shame is intolerable. It feels like you want to rip your skin off, like you cannot sit in that state. So we have to do something. And that's why we do those containment behaviors.
Yeah, wow. I think this is going to resonate with so many people. It's going to explain what they're experiencing for themselves, but also what the partner is experiencing watching this happen. So, how does a person become safe for themselves and the people in their lives? Like, how do we take responsibility for our own shame?
Yeah. And, I've been in recovery from addiction for 15 years. And I would say that for me, what I've really been recovering from is chronic shame.
Mm,
And that the addiction for me was a function of containment.
mm,
And so I also know that part of my story is that I didn't have the big dramatic trauma story. It was hard for me to identify, why do I do some of the things that I do? And so I had to work really hard. I sometimes describe my journey of recovery and therapy particularly being like an archaeology. It was like, I had this tiny little brush and I'm trying to brush away layers and layers and layers of unawareness to eventually find a piece of something that creates some kind of sense of my story. And so the way that I think people become safe people for themselves is first about awareness. We have to begin to pay attention to what's happening in and around us. And so that was really important for me to continue to do the digging and to try to figure out what is the story of my life and how I have experienced it. And then I had to figure out new ways to work with shame. So it's like, okay, I have this shame. When it gets poked, it becomes uncontained. All my life, I have perfected the art of putting it all back in the cupboard. What other options do I have? And so I think one of the most important tools for me in becoming a safe person has been a real commitment to do the work. And really, that came about for me as a result of just once I could see what was happening in my life, and I could see the ways in which the containment strategies I was using really depended on me kind of giving away my sense of identity, like I talked about earlier, and pretending to be somebody that I wasn't, and in doing that, denying myself and betraying myself and all of those things. I committed to not doing that to myself any longer.
Yeah, so it had to start with the choice that you made for yourself.
Yeah.
So how does that work
and
for
not just a choice, but like a solid commitment, Andrea? Like the choice was like the first thing, and then the rubber hits the road when something happens, and you're like, oh. So I would pay attention to when my shame gets poked, what do I do? And what I noticed about myself is my first go-to is lie. I lie. I pretend I don't think the things I think. I pretend I don't feel the things I feel. I pretend I don't like the things I like. I don't have the opinions that I have. And so I lie either overtly or by omission, and I get small and I apologize for my presence. And like I started to really pay attention to what are the strategies that I'm currently using. And actually in the beginning, I just started doing the opposite. I'm like, okay, if I want to pretend I don't think that thing, I'm just gonna own it. I'm gonna try to own it and just say, this is what I think, which is massively risky, because like if you then go, oh, that's rubbish, I'm obviously going to be back in my shame. But I had to really start trying to create opportunities to practice something different.
So how does that work for the betrayed partner who is feeling unsafe to admit those things in the presence of a person they feel is not safe to be vulnerable in that way with?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. It happens in safe community first, right? And I tell my clients this when I'm working on things like shame, or when I'm working on things like assertiveness. I'm like, okay, I don't want you to go be assertive with unsafe people. I want you to like take back your coffee in Starbucks and tell them that it's not hot enough for you. Like that's your practice ground. Is low risk relational environments. And so for betrayed partners, I would say your therapist, your coach, your group, those are the first places that you're going to begin to explore what shame is currently doing to you and what other options you have. And sometimes the very first step is just to say, this is how I'm feeling. This is the messaging that shame is telling me. Because shame is also one of those unusual emotions where you will feel more of it just because you have it. Like we feel shame about feeling shame, right? And we don't want to say out loud. And so I think, you know, everybody knows Brene Brown on shame, and she says we have to speak it out. And I would say, yeah, for partners and probably for guys in recovery too, because of course they have their own shame narratives and their own shame containment strategies. Their recovery groups and their healing spaces are the best place to practice.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, it speaks to the importance of having community, which leads to my next question, like how does a person build that sense of self-trust in all of this? Of like, even though I believe this my whole life, it's not true. And I can trust that this is true, especially when, to your analogy of wash day, like maybe I am 2 or 3 days from wash day, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I stink either, right?
Right. Right. And you know, betrayal and shame are propositions around self-trust. It's shame work is about self-trust, because my experience of shame is that when I'm in it, I am not trustworthy. I'm not
Mm,
trustworthy for myself first and foremost,
mm,
because any of my my shame containment strategies really required a level of self-abandonment and self-denial and willingness to buy into the lies that I was believing about myself. And they might be like those surface level lies of I'm not good enough, but actually at a deeper level, it's about my worthiness, it's about my value, it's about my right to take up space in the world, my right to feel my feelings, my right to have my own opinions. It's really a much deeper proposition. And every time I gave away that sense of identity, I gave away my ability to trust myself. Like, will I stand up for myself? And so working with shame is about building self-trust. It's
mhm,
about being willing to tell the truth about who I am, willing to tell the truth about what I want, what I'm entitled to, what my rights are. And so the role of self-trust is that it's built through addressing shame in our lives. We become like a trustworthy person to ourselves first and
mhm,
foremost.
mhm. Reminds me so much of Pia Melody's family of origin work and that model of developmental maturity. Like, how do we become
Right.
functional adults? And it is so much about being that safe adult for our inner child, being that one that can speak truth that we didn't get, being able to do that for ourselves. Yes, the external validation helps, but that we don't rely on that for that
Right.
sense of self. And I think that's what you're saying in building the self-trust. It's like if I delegate that to someone else to help me trust myself, I never get to the place where I do trust myself without someone else's permission.
Right. Right. And for me at least, shame, when using that kind of idea of Pia Melody's work, shame was a reality issue. Like shame kept me living in an alternate reality where the truth wasn't true and the way I presented myself to the world wasn't true. It's like this kind of ideal self, which is the self I want to be, and the real self, which is the self that I behave like I am.
Hmm.
There was not a lot of overlap, and that's why I had so much shame, because I wasn't living true to who I was. And the more I did that, the less overlap there was. And so yeah, it's a process of integrity building, I suppose, from an addiction recovery perspective. From a partner betrayal perspective, it's a process of healing the lies that have been sown into your life. But if you
Hmm.
have
Hmm.
developmental trauma, if you have that developmental shame, you might have to go all the way back and figure out, where did that come from in the first place?
Sure, sure. And I think many partners can relate to that. Like you said, it's not every partner, but I think I would say the majority of partners can trace that back to an earlier voice, an earlier experience.
Yeah,
Even if it's something that they've done work around, somehow the re-experiencing that feeling reopens that wound. And, if you
absolutely.
You've
Yeah,
got
and
to
like
do that.
whatever is left of that is going to get poked, which was exactly what happened to me.
Yeah, yeah. So how has your sense of identity, your sense of self changed after recovery from both addiction and betrayal?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and I think the most concise way that I can tell you the answer to that is to say I just know who I am now. Like I
Mm,
just know what I'm about, what I stand for, connected to this kind of sense of purpose. And we talk a lot about kind of values and knowing our values and that kind of stuff. And when I started working professionally in this field, I realized I never did any like specific values work. I did a lot of therapy, I did a lot of other things, but I didn't do specific values work. But somehow, as I kind of walked out my recovery journey, first from addiction, then from the beginnings of kind of my shame work, and then through betrayal and trauma work, what has come to emerge is this very clear set of values. Like I know what's important to me in life. And in the very early days of my recovery, I didn't have that. And so I think knowing who I am, knowing what I'm about is kind of where that sense of identity has come from. And for me, interestingly, again, I guess this is because shame has really been a massive part of my journey. The value that has kind of floated to the top for me is authenticity. It's that I show up truthfully in every situation. And that doesn't mean that I show up exactly the same in every situation. I have different professional boundaries than I have within my friendships, but it means that I'm going to be honest about what I bring, and who I am and what I stand for. And when I'm not able to do that, I'm pretty much no good to my clients, to my kids, to my husband, to my friends, because we're now in an inauthentic relationship, right? And so
mhm.
I think that's the biggest thing for me. I'm not perfect, but I'm 100% committed to living authentically.
Yeah, I mean, it's accepting that perfectly imperfect identity,
Right.
right? That I'm
Right.
never going to reach a place where I have it all together, where I have it all figured out. I'm going to make mistakes. People are going to notice my flaws, but because I've accepted that myself, it doesn't poke that place like you talked about before.
Right.
I don't have a shame about it because I've accepted the reality that I'm a human being who's perfectly
Right.
imperfect.
And so if you do get me on day 5 after hair wash and you say, "Hey, Kat, your hair smells a bit funky," I'm going to go, you're right. I'll go wash it. I'm not going to crumble into shame. I'm not going to cry because my hair doesn't smell good. I'm just going to go wash it. I'm just going to go take care of it, because now I realize some people on some days, their hair doesn't smell as good as it does on wash day. That's just a part of life, right? And that's the big difference.
Right? Or you can tell that person to just back up, set a
Right.
boundary.
Yeah, if you don't like it, right.
You have options.
Absolutely.
You have choices. So what are
Mm.
some practices? Because I know people are going to listen to this and they're going to say, well, all that sounds good and dandy. But like, what does that look like in my everyday life, walking that out?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I have a couple of really key practices. And one of the first thing I'm going to say is like one of those eye roll, yeah, everybody says that about shame things, which is self-compassion. But I practice self-compassion in a combination of very distinct ways that have been really important for me. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily the way everybody needs to practice self-compassion, but this is what's worked for me. So I practice a combination of what I call kind of soft self-compassion, which is where I'm just nice to myself. I'm nicer to myself. I make space for speaking kindly to myself. All of those things that most people associate with self-compassion are part of my practice. But I also practice what I've heard Kristen Neff, who does a lot of work with self-compassion, I've heard her refer to this as kind of fierce self-compassion. And actually, I would say out of the two, for me, fierce self-compassion is probably the more important way of doing that. And for me, fierce self-compassion is that it means that I am fiercely self-protective, that I just refuse to continue to betray and abandon myself. I won't stand for it. And so for those who like a word picture, this is my kind of Gandalf moment on the bridge where he's like, you shall not pass. I'm like, I'm not going to do that to myself. Shame will not get past me if I can help it. And so I have this kind of internal reaction because I know what shame feels like. I notice the feeling, and then Gandalf shows up and he's like, nope, not today, dragon. And so it's like that commitment manifests in that kind of fierce self-compassion, where I know what shame wants me to do, and I just refuse to participate in that game. So that for me is probably the most kind of in the moment tool that I practice. But then something else that has been super important for me is the idea of self-repair, which is I don't get it right all of the time. And sometimes shame sneaks up on me, or it pops up in a place I wasn't expecting it to pop up, or it kind of gets me in the moment and I don't quite catch it. And so self-repair is about that ongoing commitment to live differently. And so when I don't catch it in the moment, I usually spend 5 minutes kind of kicking myself and feeling cross about it and being like, damn it, I didn't catch it. And then I will reverse engineer what just happened and what ways did I show up in shame that are not who I am. And like I said before, typically for me, that's some kind of dishonesty, some kind of shutting down of what's true for me, some kind of getting small, some kind of apologizing for existing. And I will go back and I will repair that the best way that I can. And so if I don't know, I had an example recently where I felt some shame around asking questions in a training environment. And I didn't quite catch it in the moment. And so the next time I saw that trainer, I made sure that I asked all of my questions. I made sure that I didn't shut down the curious, inquisitive, always wanting to learn part of who I am. I wanted to affirm that I have a right to learn. I have a right to ask my questions. I paid money to be here to do that, right? And so it's about kind of going back and writing. I guess, from a recovery perspective, it's amends, right? It's putting right what went wrong. And I have an equally fierce commitment to that self-repair.
So yeah, I mean, that self-compassion, Kristen has on one side, it's like the yin yang symbol, and then, on the other side is a bear. It's like, it doesn't always mean just, softness and kindness. I mean, that's included, but like you said, there are times where you have to be fierce, where you have to take a stand, where you really have to channel that inner strength wherever you find that. And then, I can see this being like so much work for people, especially if you haven't practiced it. Like, so what encouragement do you have for people who are like, I can't do that. Like, I'm just so tired. I've tried, I've done this, I've done that. Like, how do you keep yourself, what do you say to remind yourself that this takes a lot of energy, and just because it's hard doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong?
Yeah, and I guess that question is fundamentally tied to the shame-based concept of what I deserve and what I am worth, right? Because what I would say from my 15-year recovery vantage point is it's so worth it. It's so worth it because, and I guess there's like, for me, there's like this parallel process of the more I learn about the way shame functions in my life and the more I address it, the more freedom I have to be who I am and the better I feel about that. And so it's actually really difficult at the beginning of a shame recovery journey to know that what lies ahead of you is good, because actually it doesn't feel good to be exposed. It feels like such a huge risk. And
Right.
so, like, on the one hand, I want to say you just have to take our word for it. Like, I trust me when I tell you that it's worth it, because it's so hard to even conceptualize a world in which I can totally be myself and feel really wonderful about it. Like, that just is an alien concept. But I think that we have to taste and see that it is good, right? And so my nervous system needed an opportunity to experience something different. And when I committed to that process and I started doing it, I really surprised myself and my nervous system. I'm like, oh, people are generally really nice. They're generally really understanding. They generally are not thinking the things that I think that they're thinking about me. They're generally caring and compassionate people. And so I kind of, in a way, had to go on this bit of a journey of proving wrong the shame narratives that I was believing. But that's not enough by itself. Like, you have to have that. You can't just talk yourself out of shame. If you could, none of us would have it, because you know, and I know that we talk to clients all the time who are like, I know this isn't true, but somehow I feel this. So we're trying to get to that sort of deeper body-based knowingness that exists within our clients. And so we need to have that new experience. We need to re-encode that new experience into our nervous system. And so it is a risk. It absolutely is a risk. And it's so worth it.
Yeah, I love that. And you are worth it. That's what I hear you saying. Not
Yeah.
just that the experience is worth it, but that you do it because you are worth it, because you deserve to live an authentic life, because you are worth being able to show up fully and not trying to contain, and
Right.
stuff things. Yeah.
Right. And having some really great, safe people to practice that with is super important. So kind of going back to that question before, there are some places you're just going to trial it out, but then there are some deeper relationships. Hopefully you've got either a great therapist or a great coach who can work at that relational depth with you, where you can take a risk, and because they've got their shame in order, they can hold that with you and say, gosh, that's brave. That is so brave of you to show that part of who you are to me. So brave of you to try something new, and you can be affirmed in your truthfulness. And I mean, like, that depth of truthfulness. This is what I think. This is how I feel. This is the truth of who I am. And so, I really hope that people are able to find one or two really safe people who've done their own work around shame, who can celebrate the truth of who they are.
Yeah. Well, I know you've got some safe people there at Naked Truth. So if people want to reach out for support, join one of your groups, link up with one of your coaches, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, they can just find us at nakedtruthproject.com. They'll learn all about the wider work of our organization, as well as the kind of menus there that are available for folks looking for recovery resources.
Okay. And their groups are wonderful. I can say that from experience. So even if you tried a group, even if you tried a process and it didn't work, I think what Kat is inviting everyone into today who's listening to this is an opportunity to try again. And there's real bravery in, like you said, taking that risk, stepping out and trying again.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kat. I love this. I know that people are probably feverishly taking notes. So if you missed what Kat said, be sure you get the all access pass so you can go back and watch this as many times as you need to, because I think this is the kind of conversation that one time it just doesn't sink in. Like, there's so much rich knowledge that you shared that I think it would be worth people watching it multiple times.
Well, thank you so much for having me back. I've loved chatting with you today.
Yes, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Betrayal Recovery Radio, hosted by Dr. Jake Porter. If you value the content we've shared today, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review. This helps others find the show, and we greatly appreciate it. For more resources, visit APSATS.org. That's APSATS.org.